Oh no. Oh no. I forgot about Thanksgiving dinner. It's okay. It's fine. It'll be totally fine. Right, Joyous Me? Oh yeah, it's gonna be great. We've got this. Hate to rain on your parade, but we've hosted like a friend or two for dinner. This is big. Do you know how big our family is? And you know how judgy Aunt Barb is. Oh, be quiet, fearful me. It'll be fine. Okay, well, we're getting this catered, right? I mean, you remember we almost burned the house down trying to boil water. I asked you never to speak of that again. Yeah, that was one time, and we've totally improved since then. It's gonna be fine. Thank you. Yes, it will be fine. It'll be good. It's gonna be great. We're gonna burn the house down.
Most of you know that I am not an overly emotional person. In fact, some of you might even question if I have emotion. But I went to a Canes game a couple nights ago. By the way, they're playing amazing hockey right now. And I'm going to cheer like every other fan. When they score a goal, you know, I'm standing up, I'm high-fiving perfect strangers who are sitting around me that I've never met before. But I'm not going to be the guy that's trying to get the attention of the camera, right? So I get on the big Jumbotron or whatever. Like, I'm not that guy. I'm not, when they say, hey, let's get loud, that's not me. I'm not going to go crazy. In fact, I really get overly excited about anything. When I got married to Martha, she was surprised that I didn't scream at the TV during athletic events, because that's how in her home, her father, her brothers, they would get crazy in the living room watching a game on TV. That's not me. I'm not going to fly off the handle and get angry. That rarely you will see that in me. And I'm not going to get overly discouraged about something. That's not the norm for me. Now, I can and I have, but that's just not me. I'm kind of even keel. And so some of that, no doubt, is part of my personality, right? But whatever the case, what is true about me, about you, whether or not we show our emotions, we all deal with emotions. We're happy one minute and we are sad the next. We cry, we laugh, we get anxious, we get impatient, we get angry, we harbor bitterness at times and resentment. We struggle with discouragement. We even get depressed from time to time. We are emotional beings. Watch this. Because we are created in the image of our Creator. And we often don't think about our Creator as being emotional. And not only that, as followers of Jesus, we often dismiss our emotions and emotional health as insignificant and unimportant. In fact, sometimes we just straight up ignore our emotional health as followers of Jesus. This week we begin a brand new series entitled All the Feels, focusing our attention on what it looks like to be emotionally healthy as followers of Jesus. And so the question right out of the bat is why? Why are we doing this series, and why now? And so let me just hit the why now question first. So when our communicator team began to look at the rest of this year last spring and start to map out our series, we looked at this season. We're getting ready to enter into the holiday season. And this season, historically, is a tough season for a lot of people. And I just started to think back at some of the families in this body who have lost loved ones. And it'll be their first holiday season without people that they have enjoyed the holiday season with for years. And then you have people that are away from family, estranged from family. Then you have the stress of the season and the activity and trying to meet up to all of the expectations. So this is a tough season. And then 2, COVID. We don't talk a lot about the impact that COVID has had on our emotional health, inside and outside the church. Man, it has been a challenging 18 months. Isolation and loneliness and anxiety and depression and despair and anger and even division inside the church, outside the church. Look, I am glad that we are able to offer like online gatherings. And this morning we have people that are joining us online from this family. And it's been a blessing. There have been a lot of churches that weren't set up to have online gatherings. And so it's been a blessing to offer that this season and to offer some of what we do online. But let's be honest. The absence of being in person has an impact on our spiritual formation, both this community and individually. We, by definition, the church is people. And we, by design, are meant to come together in community and operate in community. And so that's one reason I'm so glad to have our brothers and sisters from HT back with us today. So that kind of addresses our timing. Why now for this particular series, but why this topic? Why this topic of emotional health? Simply put, you and I cannot become who God has designed us to become. We cannot practice the way of Jesus together and not address our emotional health. Said more precisely, quoting pastor and author Pete SCAZZERO, it's impossible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. In other words, you and I cannot compartmentalize our emotional well-being, ignoring it as irrelevant in our relationship with Jesus. Like every one of us in this room and watching online, we can fool ourselves into thinking we are spiritually mature despite what our emotions are telling us, as if they are disconnected from our person. For example, we all know people, or we are one, and I know that's not proper English, who claim to be a devout follower of Jesus, but year after year, they cannot control their anger. Where they smile and they say all the right things when they're in this room or with other people, but then they go home and they verbally or physically abuse their spouse or their family. Or we know somebody who is incredibly consistent when it comes to being in this place and being in the Word or praying or having their devotions, and yet they hold on to this critical, divisive, and judgmental spirit. Or we know some others that claim to believe in the peace of God that passes all understanding, but then just through a short scroll through social media or watching cable news, they find themselves unnerved and starting to get anxious about what they see. Or someone maybe even sitting in this room around a group of people or even part of this family, and that they feel completely isolated and alone. Where's the disconnect? Where's the disconnect? Why isn't Jesus making a substantive difference below the surface in our lives? Where's the joy? Why am I continuing in my anxiety? Why can't I control my anger? These are questions that we're going to get into in this series. But before we dig in there's just a few things, maybe some disclaimers. This topic is massive. It's massive, and I am growing in it personally. And so in this series, we're not going to be able to dive into all the particular and specific emotions. Not that we won't hit a few of them. We're going to hit a few of them, especially some of the darker ones that seem to derail our lives. And we're going to give you some really practical help. But there's only so much that we can tackle in a 4-week series. And we talked about it a couple weeks ago when we started to map out as a communicator team 22. And we're going to come back to this in the summer of 22. And we're going to walk through some of the Psalms and look at, again, emotional health. So that's one. The topic's massive. And number two, we're not psychologists, psychiatrists, or therapists, or counselors. And we're not going to try to be from this platform. As we go through this series, you may find yourself needing a little bit of extra help, like something might be uncovered, and so you're going to need some professional help, and we can help you and point you in the right direction. We have partners in the city, professional counselors that can help in this area. The church, in some ways, has done a disservice to emotional health by explaining it away with spiritual platitudes like, you're probably just not praying enough, or you don't have enough faith, or you need to spend some more time in the Word. And so what happens is a follower comes into this area that might be struggling with chronic depression or anxiety, and they are made to feel less than. Something's wrong with them because they've been practicing some of these spiritual disciplines, and it has not yet helped them with their emotional issues. Now look, we're not going to dismiss or minimize where you are emotionally. What we're going to try and do is build this biblical framework to help point you in the right direction. And then thirdly and lastly, in this series, we're going to make a distinction between emotional health and mental health. And we're going to focus on emotional health. Now, granted, there are connections between the two. They're interconnected. But for our purposes, we're going to focus on the emotions in the normal range of our day-to-day and how they impact our spiritual lives. So with all of that being said, the goal today is simply to put a spotlight on this subject. And I'm not going to park on any one particular passage of Scripture. I'm going to be all over the place and reference many. But this talk is designed to get your attention on the subject matter at hand. Because our tendency is to walk by it. Our tendency, again, is to gloss over it, over our emotional health, but that's costly. That's costly because a fundamental part of what it means to being human is to have emotion. And being human, theologically speaking, is that we are an image bearer of God. That's who we are. And I love what Longman and Allender say in their book, Cry of the Soul. All emotions, including the darker ones, give us a glimpse of the character of God. When we see emotion from God, from page 1, when we open up our Bibles, we see God's emotion as he sits back at the conclusion of creating the entire world. He says this in Genesis 1:31, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. It was like sitting back like, wow, this, look at all of this. This is amazing. Great pleasure. But then if you just go a few more pages in the Scriptures, we read this in Genesis 6:5-6. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. From extremely pleased to extremely grieved. The emotion of God. In Exodus 20, God describes himself as a jealous God when adoration and worship that is rightfully his is traded in for something else or someone else. We see the anger of God over sin and disobedience and evil, but then in Exodus 34:6, one of the most frequently recited descriptions of God's character, we read this: the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. And as you walk through the Old Testament, you see the activity and emotion of God, and then you begin to turn the page into the New Testament, and then you see Jesus, God in the flesh, as John says in John chapter 1, verse 14. He became flesh and dwelt among us. And then we read in Colossians 1 where the Apostle Paul says he holds everything. He's the image of the invisible God. And God put skin on and dwelt among us. He lived among his creation. And if there was anyone that was comfortable in his own skin, it was Jesus. He displayed the full array of emotions perfectly. Think about that just for a minute. Perfectly. I don't know about you, but if I just dial the clock back just a week and look at my emotional health, I can promise you there were moments in my past week that I did not always manage and express my emotions appropriately. But with Jesus, it was a different story. He managed and expressed his emotions without sin. Without sin, appropriate at every turn. And so we, as followers of Jesus, we seldom sit with and meditate on the humanity of Jesus, on his emotions. But if we were just to stop and take an hour and start thumbing through one of the Gospels in the New Testament, we would be overwhelmed by the emotion that comes off the page, and we would be captured by it. Just a few accounts out of John's Gospel. John's account of Jesus. In John 2, we see he goes from joy to anger, where he performs his first miracle at this wedding. So really festive occasion. And his mom asks him, and he does that. But then he moves from that festive occasion to the temple, where he, in his anger, he overturns tables because there were merchants there that were using this opportunity of worship for personal gain. And so that brings out the anger in Jesus. In John 8, in chapter 8 and chapters 15 through 17, we see Jesus expressing joy in pleasing his Father and bringing glory to his Father with his life. In John 11, we see Jesus coming into Judea in this scene where Lazarus has died. And so Jesus had stayed back a couple days, but then he comes into Judea, and there is all of this emotion. But rather than calling people out for their emotion or their lack of faith or whatever, Jesus steps into that, and you see him weeping over his friends that are tore up and that are brokenhearted. In John chapter 18 and 19, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, anguish over what is about to happen on the crucifixion, on the cross. And then we see him on the cross. During his crucifixion, he feels forsaken by his Father. And then we see in John chapter 19, while he's on the cross, we see this loving forgiveness from Jesus. Not this bitterness that's been building up because of the betrayal of the last several days. No, we see him forgiving those around him. Practicing the way of Jesus is to see Jesus as the true human being, the true image bearer of God. And watch this, to identify with him. That's mark number 1 of 7 marks, where a disciple finds their identity in Jesus. Because of the indwelling Holy Spirit, we have the power to be emotionally healthy. What is true of Jesus is true of me as we abide with him and align our life with him and act out of obedience. It's not only possible for us to be emotionally healthy, it is already happening. It's happening if you're a follower of Jesus. We just have to pay attention. We have to pay attention and surrender to what Jesus is doing in all areas of our life, including the area of our emotional health. Prior to moving to Raleigh, when Kyle was in elementary school, we were in Annapolis, living in Annapolis, and there was a season where Kyle's school was being renovated and rebuilt. So they were moving all of these elementary kids to a different school. So Martha and I had to drive Kyle to school. And so on one occasion, Martha and I were in the car together, driving him to school. And Martha glanced over and she saw that my fuel gauge was on empty. Now, something you need to know about me. I drive until my fuel gauge is on empty. All right? Some of y'all fill up at half a tank or whatever. For me, I wait until it's buried on E. Like right now, I have a car that tells me how many miles I have until it's empty. Well, I don't fill it up until it says, please refuel. That's when I fill it up. So this day, so Martha gets in the car. She's exasperated that we're on empty again. And she says, Paul, we're going to need to stop and get some gas before we drop Kyle off for school. And of course, you know my answer. No, we're fine. Like, we're fine. Let's just drop him off at school first, and so he's on time, and then we'll go get some gas. And so we, at that moment, to make a long story short, we were in disagreement about how we should proceed from there. Healthy conversation. So about a mile before we get to the school, I ran out of gas. At a busy intersection in Annapolis, morning rush hour, but I'm always looking at the positive side of things. So fortunately, the grade of the road, it was like a downgrade, and so there was a gas station on the opposite corner of the road. And so I had Martha slide over to the driver's seat, which she was excited to do. And then Kyle, he's thinking this is an adventure, right? So he's in elementary school. And then I get out and I push the car through the intersection into the gas station, and we get some gas. So then after I get gas, I get back into the car. And needless to say, I was feeling all the feels from Martha, right? And rightfully so. The point being, how I treated my gas gauge is often how you and I treat the information that our emotions are giving us. There are times, in many cases, where our emotions are screaming at us. They are screaming at us. They're sending us messages to help us grow, to show us and maybe reveal where we might be unhealthy. But we, as I was doing with both my gas gauge and Martha, we dismissed them. You see, one of the gauges that we have on the dashboard of our life is our emotional gauge. It's much like the physical gauge. So when you and I are hungry, or you and I are in pain, our body tells us. And it moves us to action. And in fact, sometimes it demands us to action. Well, in the same way, we have an emotional gauge, but it's different in that it reveals what is happening deep within you. It communicates how the reality of what is happening on the outside of us is impacting what is going on in the depth of who we are. Again, from Longman and Allender, it says that emotions are the language of the soul. They are the cry that gives the heart a voice. However, we often turn a deaf ear through emotional denial, distortion, or, like I often do, disengagement. And failure to pay attention to our emotional gauge will bring failure in primarily three ways. One, we fail to see who we really are below the surface. Again, emotions are the cry of the soul, whether positive like joy, contentment, peace, and excitement, or negative, right? Like anger, fear, anxiety, jealousy, or shame. Listen, they are not spontaneous or accidental. I know what some of you are thinking right now. They are connected to the real picture of our lives. And that is so crucial to understand as we are growing into maturity as followers of Jesus. Because I know what some of you are thinking when I said that they're not spontaneous or accidental. You're like, well, Paul, that outburst of anger by me, that seemed pretty spontaneous at the moment. Now, granted, our emotions can be volatile, right? They can be unpredictable and even unreliable, which is why many of us have developed these mechanisms to where we respond to our emotions that don't necessarily help us to become more like Jesus. The first two I personally struggle with. First one is we push aside our emotions. We straight up ignore, dismiss our emotions as unreliable, or that there's some kind of weakness as a follower of Jesus, especially our negative emotions. We even create all of this God activity. Right? We stay busy to avoid dealing with it. We focus on doing instead of being. So we do all of this stuff. And even when we get home, our minds are distracted. We're not even present there because we are focused on the doing part, not the being. But I'm just telling you that doing comes from being as a follower of Jesus. Second, we push down our emotions. We stuff them in, and we work to keep them in check because we think they're a liability. And so we have this attitude, I don't want anybody to see me sweat. And when we do that, though, we subtract our identity with Jesus and his humanity. We ignore the impact of our emotions. And some of us, we yield to our emotions. We let them have free reign, and they kind of inform everything we do. Yeah, you're right, I'm angry. Did you see what they did to me? Man, I can't wait. They're going to get a piece of me. I'm telling you, they're going to get a piece of my mind. And so our emotions then inform all of our behavior. We yield to them. We think that that's the only stream of information that we need. Or we overcompensate for our emotions. We think that we're always supposed to show positive emotions, and they have to rule the day, and we have to rid ourselves of any negative emotions. And we see the results of overcompensating all the time, where because we don't know how to manage or express them, then we over-medicate because we feel like we're supposed to feel a certain way all the time or present ourselves a certain way. I was talking to Martha about this the other day. I think, honestly, followers of Jesus might even be worse at this than non-followers. Because as followers of Jesus, we pretend, we fake, we put on a mask because we don't know how to express and manage emotions that, man, I shouldn't feel this way. And there's all kinds of other mechanisms that we're going to hit in this series, like spiritualizing away conflict or covering over our weakness or living without limits. The point is that our emotional gauges are giving us a picture of us that we shouldn't ignore. It's often referred to as being self-aware. St. Teresa of Avila wisely observed that almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge, knowing who you are. Even Reformed theologian John Calvin said this: our wisdom consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and ourselves. When we look at the great commandment, Jesus said, love God with everything you have, and then love others as what? As you love yourself. So when you fail that, when you look at the Apostle Paul and where he continued to inspect himself so he wasn't disqualified, and then he said to Timothy, hey, pay attention to yourself and to your teaching. A second, when we fail to pay attention to our emotional gauge, we fail to see our emotions and how they're impacting our relationships. Man, there is a lot to be said about this, and we're going to jump into this in week 4 of this series. But our emotions, positive and negative, man, they emerge in the context of all of our relationships. Man, we are all different in this room and online, and we, because of sin in the world, we are all imperfect. And so when you get a bunch of imperfect people together, it's gonna, all kinds of emotions are gonna come out. And it gives us a glimpse of who we are, of our heart. And if we don't pay attention, man, the consequences could be painful. Let me just play this out a little bit. I was talking to a dad this past week whose daughter's in a bad relationship. And his daughter got into the relationship because she was just unhealthy emotionally. She was looking for a guy that would meet some of her needs. And so she got mixed up with a guy who was unhealthy. And so now you have a couple that is building their relationship on an unhealthy, unstable relationship. And what's happening now, it's starting to spill over into the family, and it's spilling over into other relationships. Man, paying attention to our emotional gauge is huge when it comes to growing in relationships and how we relate with people. Because ultimately, it's a sign of something bigger that brings us to our third and most significant fail, and that's we fail to see that our emotions reveal about our relationship with our Heavenly Father, with God. Our level of self-awareness and how we are expressing or managing our emotions in our everyday circumstances and relationships with others is pointing to something far deeper, far more fundamental, and that is our relationship with God. Deep below the surface, our emotions are revealing what we believe about God. It's answering all of our questions about God, His character, His nature, His activity in the world, and our relationship with Him. As Pete SCAZZERO writes, when we neglect our most intense emotions, we are false to ourselves, and we close off an open door through which to know God. God is using our emotions to communicate to us. And if you haven't heard anything I've said today, I want you to listen to this. If you're a follower of Jesus, God wants to do and is in the process of conforming you to the image of His Son, Jesus. He is at work in you. We are a work in process. It's this big word, sanctification. We are not yet what we're going to be. What we are in process. And if you could just see, if you could see what he wants to do in and through you, it would blow your mind. But we need to pay attention to ourselves. So where do we start? This week, it's about simply looking at your emotional gauge. That's it. That's your spiritual practice this week. Just look at your emotional gauge. Carve out some time daily in your week for silence and solitude, and begin learning to listen to your emotions. Now, I know what some of you are saying. Paul, enough with the silence and solitude. You guys have been talking about that for weeks and weeks through our Bible series. Listen, we have talked about this. Your relationship with Jesus, my relationship with Jesus, is not one of these drive-through experiences. It takes time. It takes intentionality. So put some time on your schedule this week for silence and solitude, in the morning or at night. And this is what I want to encourage you to do, and I did it this past week. Just pay attention to where you are. I will tell you, getting into this series over this past 18 months, I am learning with you. I am not an expert here. And there is work to do on me through this. So sit down, get quiet, and recap your day. If it's at night, recap your day. Or if it's in the morning, look back to the day before. And solitude is simply being open and vulnerable to God. Just bearing your whole being before him. Nothing is hidden. Nothing's off limits. And so when you get in that, so what are you looking for? What are you doing in that time? So I would just tell you, start small. Like, identify one emotion maybe from the day before or that day. No more than 3. And then ask these questions. What kinds of emotions did you feel? So there's this wheel, this emotion wheel, right? Where was I sad, or was I frustrated, or did I get angry, or do I feel numb? Like, what is or are the emotions that I'm feeling? Or what circumstances or relationships gave rise to those emotions? Like, what was causing that? What happened to make me feel that way? And what did you feel? And how did it impact you? What was your body saying? Look, the goal is not to correct your emotions this week. That's not the goal. We're going to get into that next week. We're going to jump into Abraham, looking at Abraham next Sunday. But it's not to replace the bad ones with the good ones. That's not the goal. It's just to assess and figure out what your emotions are communicating. Ask for the guidance of the Holy Spirit. As a follower of Jesus, you have a teacher inside of you. Ask for his guidance. And in time, as we practice the way of Jesus together, we're not only going to pay closer attention to our emotional gauge, we're going to learn how to express and manage our emotions from the wisdom that we're getting from inside.